Homosexuality, the word itself conjures up multiple stigmas. Often, many of these stigmas develop out of fear, based on rumor or untruth, and can have damaging effects on those they affect, from individuals to whole communities. One negative effect of stigmas is that it can lead to mental, verbal, and/or physical abuse, resulting in crimes or attacks against those who are targeted. Throughout the country, as well as the DMV, many police departments have formed hate crimes units, specifically assigned to investigate and deter this type of behavior.
So the Special Liaison Division is comprised of a number of units, including the Asian Liaison, the Latino Liaison, Gay and Lesbian Liaison Unit, and they track crimes that occur in the city, specifically around those marginalized communities, but they also receive information on hate crimes or bias crimes that take place in the city and that are reported. Well, the mission of the division is to provide a method through which marginalized communities can more readily interact with government and law enforcement. We work to dispel the myths and the distrust that may exist between different communities. Because we do have a diverse city, we want to make sure that all members of the community receive equal access to law enforcement. When you're speaking of bias crimes, hate crimes, and things like that, those are crimes that not only is there an actual crime that has taken place, but it also influences the community because it is the inalienable aspects of an individual that's been attacked, whether it's race, religion, or color, or sexual orientation. These things affect the individual, but then the community feels that repercussion also. So that's a challenge. Oftentimes people don't want to come forward with that because the stigmas, the bias that they may feel because they were attacked because of something that they can't change themselves.
Is it enough to leave it to the police? Since the core of most negative issues is fear and misunderstanding, wouldn't it be better to open the dialogue and address these stigmas and concerns firsthand? In communities of color, there seems to be a code of silence wrapped around discussing issues of sexual orientation and bias. Why? What are we afraid of? Hi, I'm Millette Green. Welcome to another program in our ongoing series, Vocal Point. In this program, we're going to tackle the ongoing stigmas of homosexuality in communities of color. We've gathered several members of our DC Metro community to speak firsthand about their experiences with dealing with stigmas in their respective communities of color. We'll also take a look at the faith-based community by speaking with a pastor who has been working to raise awareness and encourage inclusion of the LGBT community in his local church. And lastly, we'll speak with a Howard University professor who will share her expertise on this matter, as well as speak to the recent policy changes and her involvement with this issue on an international basis. First, let's introduce our guests. May Cifuentes works for Planned Parenthood and plays an integral role in its Latino outreach and engagement efforts. She's passionate about LGBT issues and volunteers with the Latino GLBT History Project and the Women's Information Network LGBT in Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of Wellesley College in Massachusetts with a degree in political science and women and gender studies. Vinton Jones is the Communications and Education Manager at the National Black Gay Men's Advocacy Coalition. He works extensively in the area of public health communications with an emphasis on social marketing, messaging, and community mobilization in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. He's received numerous awards for his work with HIV prevention awareness. Vinton has a BS in community health from Texas A&M University and an MS in healthcare administration from the University of Texas at Arlington. And Tariq Abouata grew up in Bethlehem, Palestine, and moved to the United States along with his family at the age of 12, 2 years after the 1987 Palestinian uprising. After receiving his JD in international law from the University of Texas in 2002, He spent a year in Palestine working with the Palestinian Negotiations Support Unit. And over the past 10 years, Tarek has been involved in numerous nonviolence workshops. And in addition to his speaking and nonviolence trainings, Tarek serves as the Palestine coordinator for the Christian Peacemakers team. We thank you all for joining us for this very important topic. May, we want to start with you first to talk about the stigmas in the Latino community. Before we get more personal, just kind of give us a general overview.
Well, so it's tricky talking about, first of all, a community as a whole.
Yes.
A community that has so many different communities within the Latino community. In regards to stigmas, in regards to barriers, we always tend to go to the created stereotypes, what we've heard in our respective communities. Do we have barriers in the community? Yes. But do we have opportunities? We do. There was a recent poll that came out, I think within the last 1 year, that said that 6 out of 10 Latinos support marriage equality. That's actually the highest rate than any other group.
I was going to say, that's pretty good.
So when we talk about barriers, if we are to move the work forward, we need to talk about what we can do in the community to make sure that we're representing it correctly. We need to talk about how it is that we want to move the work forward. We do need to acknowledge, I think, the issues that we have.
Yeah, Benton, let me go to you and talk about some of the challenges in the Black community facing gay and lesbian people.
Okay. Well, I think there's an overall issue or a challenge, and this is not just in the Black community, but I think across the board when it comes to communities of color, with the overall barrier of discussing sex and sexuality in an appropriate manner. And I think that that's definitely part of the solution that has to be reached. How can we get comfortable in our homes discussing sex, and what does that mean? What does that feel like? Having a conversation, especially as we talk about youth, having a conversation that young people are having sex, and also how does that affect us in 2013 when we now have a multimedia society that if we're not teaching it or having those conversations in our homes, we have to possibly go to the point of letting the internet, have those conversations, or our peers have those conversations. So I think that's definitely one of the key core points and challenges. Is just to be able to open our spaces up, as well as our faith communities, our education outlets, to be able to be open to having a very honest dialogue and a very different dialogue than what's been had in the past around the sex we have and how we do it in our homes, and what does that mean to our family and our friends and those that we care for.
And boy, is that tough, Tarek, in the Arab community, here at home, but definitely in Palestine. Let's talk about the core of fear and lack of education being, what Vincent said a little bit. It's just really one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and for the Arab community, I think definitely post 9/11, there's so many fears that they are dealing with on a daily basis from the U.S. wider community. And so when they already have that in their minds and hearts, it challenges them even more when you have gay rights being talked about. But unfortunately, sometimes then it starts being used as an excuse not to discuss sexuality and gay rights. So how to walk that fine line in all communities of color, and particularly for me in my own Palestinian Arab community, is really hard. I, for example, went last month to, my mother was visiting from Houston, and I went to one of her friend's places, a friend that she hadn't seen since childhood. And so I actually took off the ring that I was wearing with my partner at the time, because I wasn't sure. She's gonna ask me, are you married? Do you guys have kids? And I didn't want to put my mother in a position to answer that.
Yeah.
And it would have been really awkward, if not outright I would have faced full discrimination probably from the family. So I silenced myself in that situation. And I'm not sure that that was the right decision to do, but it is a decision that I took right then and there. And I think the fear is, in a lot of the Arab community, is we don't want to adopt those Western society of being gay, being queer, whatever. We look at it as it is Western, the people who want to deny it fully in our own communities. And so that's an easy way to brush it aside. But then, okay, I am Palestinian, I'm Arab, I'm gay, then you have to face me and tell me this is Western. I grew up in Palestine. And going to Palestine is 10 times worse because not only are we faced with this discrimination, but it's just not talked about at all. So it's not that...
Not acknowledged.
It's not acknowledged at all.
It doesn't exist.
It does not exist, so you're not even discriminating against it in
Because
some
it doesn't
ways that
exist.
happen here.
Yeah.
But it's definitely tense all around.
The whole coming out process, May, you said something very interesting to me when we were doing research about coming out. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, sure. Well, so for me, the idea that change happens when a person that's not gay meets or has someone that is gay in their family is something that we know happens. We know that my family back in Mexico used to ask me about boyfriends all the time, but now they ask me about matters of the heart. So there's change that happens when you come out. Personally, I know that a lot of people don't have, just like you, a lot of people have to take a step back, look at their situation, see if it's safe enough for them to come out. And if it's not, that's completely okay.
But that's the thing. The safety part of it is what we're talking about, because you need to be safe,
right?
And in your environment. And sometimes, for many people, the most unsafe place is family.
Right. So for me, I knew that I was interested in women ever since, I don't know, kindergarten. It was just so natural to me. And I remember coming out to my mother during my senior year of high school. And the great thing, the empowering thing about that is that I had already been accepted to the school of my choice. I had a full ride. There was nothing, I wasn't living with my mother. So for me, coming out to her meant just telling her this part about my identity. It didn't mean, it couldn't have meant me being in danger of being kicked out of my house, me being in danger of losing the money to go to school, me being in danger of violence at home. It didn't mean any of that. So for me, having those blessings outside of my family life allowed me, empowered me, created this safe space that I needed to come out. My mother definitely now is better with it. The people back home are better with it, but that was only able to happen because I had a lot of privilege in where I was living.
And as you said, that's the exception to the rule.
That is the exception to the rule.
We're talking about people who are uninsured, they really depend on their family, and so, if you need your family unit and your family is totally against this lifestyle.
And especially for people of color.
Yeah.
We know that people of color are more likely to live in poverty. We know that they're more likely to be uninsured. We know that they're more likely to just not have those resources that they need to sometimes live the best healthy life that they can. So it is especially seen in communities of color, I think, that we have to take certain choices, to make certain choices to be to live the healthiest lives we can.
Yeah, it's a careful process. You were careful about coming out as well in your family, with your family and friends. Tell me about your experience.
It was a process. It was something that I did when I was 23 years old, and so I guess the caution came just from making sure that I was able to sustain myself if anything happened. I definitely was not worried about safety, nor is it is it a concern now? I think that the challenges, especially being a member of a community of color or just being a black man, I think that you still have to deal with the racial challenges that exist. When I walk out of the house, I don't fear, what's going to happen because I'm gay. I fear what's going to happen because I'm black, and I'm a black man. And what does that bring along? And so with my family, we go back to
But being black and gay?
Absolutely. With being black and gay, I think that brings on a combination of concern, but it's rooted around my racial identity and how do we deal with that, because you have to deal with police, you have to deal with stigmas around that comes with being a black man. Also, not black gay man, a black gay man living with HIV. Back to your question. Dealing with my family, I grew up, I definitely have a very close relationship with my family. And when I came out to more or less my immediate family first about being gay. And then after graduating college, that's when I made the choice to tell the rest of my family. And as I started the process of coming out in my family, you get a lot of people that say, well, I kind of knew already. So. It was just something that more or less I had to admit and stand in my own truth. And once I did that, me and my family were having a very different conversation.
That's good to know. Tadic, your baby sister embraced you when you came out. She's the first person you told? Is that right?
I had actually told my parents.
Okay.
And their first reaction was, they wanted me to speak to the pastor, Lutheran pastor at the church we were going to, and I refused. Come to find out actually that pastor had married a lesbian couple a couple of years later, so I wish I had taken that darn opportunity when it presented itself. But then they told me, do not tell your sister. And of course, I said, I will. I was 18 at the time, she was 13. And her name, I said, Yara. I went up to her and I looked at her and I said, Yara, I have something to tell you. All she did at 13, and she came to this country when she was 7, had no idea about anything gay or queer or anything. And she just said, I know. And she gave me a hug. And we had been great friends since then. I mean,
what did that do for you? Do to you, for you?
That was the first
To your
supportive
spirit.
person ever. That was the first supportive person ever, my 13-year-old sister.
Yeah.
So it calmed my heart and my spirit and my soul down immediately. And just to know that a family member, especially who's that young.
That's really good to hear. But when you put it in a broader perspective, when we're talking about communities of color and the ongoing stigmas and the challenges that remain for so many people, the barriers are big. The wall is big, isn't it, May?
I want to make sure it's big, but it's also big in a lot of different communities, and it also relates to age. So I know that the millennial generation, folks that are 14 to 29 years old, I know that they, for the most part, don't have an issue with LGBT people. They don't have an issue with LGBT people, and they reject labels. So we know that as this generation starts growing up, this is certainly in the U.S. the most diverse generation that we've ever had, and it's the most inclusive generation we've ever had. This is the generation that is going to put a stop to a lot of different discriminations, and I'm really, really excited about all the activists that are here now and that are going to be coming out, because when it comes to barriers, we are, I think, a generation that is very good at pinpointing those barriers and making sure we work together to dismantle them.
HIV/AIDS is a huge issue that you've been very passionate about, promoting education, awareness, getting tested. I want you to speak to the special challenges in the Black community with respect to this issue, and you announced your status in Jet magazine, which that's kind of different, Vinton.
It was definitely a very conscious decision. It was actually a part. I've been in D.C. for almost 3 years, and a part of the transition was being able to really step into my truth. And as I do the work, around HIV/AIDS, around LGBT equality, around racial justice and social justice. Being able to be upfront with my HIV status was something that was very important to me, and I knew that if I had a singular conversation with every member in my family, I would have been told more times than I needed to keep, will you tell me, I'm so glad to hear that you're coming out about your status, but let's just keep this quiet. And so I said I was going to put it in a magazine that, at some point would be in most people's bathrooms at some point. So that we would have to have that conversation.
In the bathrooms, in the hair salons. I mean, and you fan out the Jet magazines, you're on the table, and the old folks, back in the day, that's what we did.
And that's
it's
what
everywhere.
Still do.
Yeah, that magazine.
And that was definitely important for me to really open up the conversation about HIV. And the funny thing is, I had more of a challenge with coming out with my sexuality more than my HIV status, because when I told some of my family members, it was a very negative as far as my being gay. But when I told about my HIV status, it was definitely a very different conversation in the sense of it allowed, and this was the biggest thing to me as far as my aha moment, it allowed some of my family members to be able to start talking about their sexual behaviors. And so that was definitely important to me to put that out there in a way that you could not help but to have that conversation for no other reason, not necessarily with me, but for your friends and other people who may see, oh, don't you know Vinton, or aren't you related to Vinton? And I just continued to get that. And so that was definitely huge to me to be able to have that conversation, allow other conversations to be had because of that.
So many commonalities in the stories of communities of color dealing with stigmas. We thank you all for sharing your experiences. This has been fantastic and insightful to get your stories and your personal take, and we'll continue the conversation.
Anytime we can engage the community and engage in crime prevention and prevent crimes from happening, that's a success. Anytime an actual crime takes place and we can work together to apprehend a criminal and get that case taken all the way through prosecution, that's a great success for us. We'll work closely with any government organization, nonprofit, community groups, community members, grassroots groups, anybody who is willing to partner with the police department. Bias crimes, hate crimes, these are things that are going to be an ongoing challenge for law enforcement. We seek to always engage the community and keep them partnered with us and keep coming forward and coming up with solutions to try and someday hopefully mitigate or get rid of these kind of problems.
Joining us now, the Reverend Dr. Dennis W. Wiley. He is the pastor of the Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ here in Washington, D.C., where he has served as pastor for 28 years. A distinguished theologian, civic activist, and musician, Dr. Wiley is renowned nationally for his theological presentations and writings. Published works include Hypocrisy is the Sin in Ebony magazine and The Meaning of the African American Church of What Does It Mean to Be Black and Christian. Dr. Wiley received his BA from Harvard University, a master's from Howard University, and a master's and doctorate of philosophy degrees from the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Dr. Camilla Majid is an associate professor of social work here at Howard University. She focuses on the impact of oppression on mental health and social functioning. Dr. Majid's research focuses on racism, homophobia, heterosexism, and other oppressions, particularly as they impact mental health among people of color and individuals within the LGBTQ community. Based on her extensive work with the LGBT communities in Africa and the Caribbean, Dr. Majid often serves as an expert witness for refugees seeking asylum in the U.S. because of anti-gay persecution in their home countries. She's an author of several publications on many issues, including racism, homophobia, and mental health. And I'd like to welcome both of you to our discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Majid, I want to start with you because you have studied extensively racism as it relates to the homosexual communities of color in particular.
Well, yes, and when you say studied, I'd like to say I really have had that fortunate to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people of color, or people of the global majority, as the other term that's coming to be used, that I like a lot, because I think it's a little bit more accurate.
It's a nice
People, it's
term.
not necessarily people of any particular color, but people of the world majority are people who are non-European descent. So that's a term that's coming to be used.
Yeah.
But in terms of my research, two things that I found really echo what some of the earlier panelists spoke to. May's comment about how no community of color, no community period is monolithic is a really central one, that we really have to recognize that we are all an intersection of many identities. We all have a spiritual identity, a sexual orientation, a gender, or some of us choose not to identify by any of those things, that we identify as human, you know, but that we are composed of many different cultural components. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we paint the landscape of what different cultural communities look like. We recognize that each individual is a tree that stands out from that landscape with the different roots and different branches in terms of the causes for their experience and the ways that their experience manifests.
Yeah, it's all a very interesting and different, but much more challenging. It makes it much more challenging. But there are commonalities when we're talking about racism, stereotypes, stigmas that hold this segment of the population back.
You're right. And one of the things that I found when I've interviewed people of the global majority in Latin America, in Africa, and the Caribbean is that often what they experience is that people in their families and communities say, this is not African, or this is not, you know, Latino, and this is not, you know, this is something you got from the Americans, from the USers, and you know, that's one of the most common challenges that people who are coming out in Trinidad or in Uganda or in Bolivia are facing, that people are saying, you know, this is not part of our culture. So that people are forced to kind of choose, well, either you're, you know, Caribbean, or, you know, either you're from Trinidad or you're gay, but you can't possibly be both because this doesn't exist in our culture. But as Tarek pointed out, it's like, here I am, I exist, and I've always existed. And you know, people who have never been to America, people who don't speak a word of English. I mean, I did focus groups in South Africa, and we had to have translators because they were speaking all 12 dialects, you know, all 12 South African dialects, but no English. So they had very little, people living in the townships of South Africa, very little exposure to American culture. So it obviously, them being gay and lesbian had nothing to do with being influenced by Western culture. It was just their identity. So one of the great things about it is that we're starting to recognize that LGBTQ people exist in every country and in every part of the world, and that communities of color have to recognize internationally that they are more diverse than they think they are.
Absolutely. Reverend Dr. Wiley, let me bring you into the conversation because you are doing some amazing things. In fact, you call yourself a pioneer because of the way you and your leadership in your church have embraced the LGBT community to the point of, you know, many of the church leaders are gay and lesbians.
Right. Yes, my wife and I work together, Dr. Christine Wiley and I, as co-equal pastors of the Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ. And just as we were talking about, no community is monolithic, no church, the black church is not monolithic. Christianity in and of itself, as May and I have talked about, is not monolithic. And so our church tends to be a little different. We embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, being a Christian church, in a way that helps us to understand that God liberates us from a lot of this divisiveness that is created by the culture in which we live, whether it's racial divisiveness, class, gender, sexual orientation. And so we believe that if we're really serious about walking in the footsteps of Jesus, we're often hear WWJD, what would Jesus do? We believe that what Jesus would do would be to create a safe space in which the rich diversity of humankind might come together, and that in doing so, we don't sacrifice or yield or give up our identity that makes us individuals and makes us different.
Yeah.
But we come together not so much as a melting pot, but as a wonderful, rich blend of vegetable soup, so to speak. And we can enjoy it because we are not required to give up that which makes each and every one of us authentic. And yet at the same time, we do not allow that distinctiveness to build barriers and walls that will keep us from relating to one another, and most importantly, to keep us from loving one another.
How did you embrace this way of thinking? Because, you know, you're a man of a particular age who grew up in the South. This came about through a process, right?
Yes, and just to be succinct, I'll just mention perhaps about 5 stages to that process. You mentioned the first one, growing up in the South, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I knew what it meant to be discriminated against, and I was fortunate growing up in the home of a minister who was one who taught us by living what God would have us to do, rather than sort of pounding the Bible into our heads. And my parents always tried to stand up for what they believed was right, so that was helpful. Secondly, when I graduated from college, I worked locally here in the Washington, D.C. area at a program called Workshops for Careers in the Arts, which eventually became the Duke Ellington School of the Arts. I was a guidance counselor. And I must admit now, at one point, the president has talked about an evolution.
Yeah.
I must admit that I have evolved as well as a straight black man, and especially as a Christian man. And I'm sure at one point I was just as homophobic as anybody else. But I was in this School of the Arts, and there I was perhaps exposed to more persons of different sexual orientation than ever before. And at first I was very uptight and very guarded, but then I realized as I observed another straight man that he seemed to be relaxed. And then I had to ask myself, well, what am I so uptight about? What am I afraid of? And then I began to relax and realize that even though persons may be of different sexual orientation, they are all human beings. And they have the same joys and sorrows, hurts and pains as anybody else. The third piece was that I went to study. I studied here at Howard at the Divinity School, but I also went to Union Theological Seminary and studied with James Cone, who was considered to be the father of black liberation theology. But what I became to understand is that we've talked about the intersectionality of oppression, that I can't be concerned about the fact that I, as a black man, have been oppressed in the South without also being concerned about my brothers and sisters who are oppressed for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Whether it is oppression of gender or oppression of sexual orientation. I feel rather hypocritical without also acknowledging that. I forgot one other piece, and that is that there was a young man when I began working in the church, before I became a pastor. I was working with the youth, and I realized that this young man, when we put on a play, it seemed as though he was struggling with his sexuality. And I sat down and talked with him and counseled him. And that taught me a lot about the fact that he didn't choose this. He wasn't making it up. He wasn't trying to be something. He was trying to be himself. And yet the struggle was with his family and with the church and what society would say about it. Finally, I did my dissertation on Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman is a great African-American, he's deceased now, preacher, author, philosopher, theologian, etc. And he always talked about listening to the sound of the genuine within oneself, and also being able to listen to the sound of the genuine in other people. And he always said, I always wanted to know how to be me without making it difficult for you to be you.
Definitely.
That was very helpful for me.
Yeah, and that brings us to talking about the value of embracing tolerance for the sake of homosexual and heterosexuals, because this is where we have to go. You know, our president of the United States has talked about this moving forward, and many other leaders and community people from grassroots all up. We've got to talk about the importance of embracing tolerance for heterosexuals and homosexuals in order to evolve. Anybody want to start with that? Yeah.
In our church, we emphasize not just tolerating our LGBT brothers and sisters, but celebrating our LGBT brothers and sisters. And accepting, of course, welcoming, accepting, affirming But you know, to tolerate sort of suggests.
So tolerate is not necessarily the best word.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
We're learning. This is what this is
Sure,
about.
sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, to tolerate something is okay. I might not like it or whatever, but I'm just going to bear with it. But to celebrate it helps us to realize that these persons bring an element to our experience that we would be deprived of.
But
Their
I
gifts,
think-
their talents, their skills, etc.
Let me say this though. I think for some people, because we're talking about breaking down barriers,
Yes.
but for some people, the first stage may be tolerance. You know, I'm being the devil's advocate
Right,
here.
right, yeah.
When you're dealing with people who have a problem,
Right.
getting to acceptance and embracing, maybe tolerance is the first step.
And I pose
Because you can't beat somebody into changing their mind.
No, you can't beat them. And the reason I ask that, and that's really the question, the way that it's posed to people who may be in opposition. And I think
Because
that
that sounds aggressive. See,
Oh.
that sounds argumentative and combative. If you say
Right.
that to someone who is at least listening,
right.
you know?
And,
Let's
it's opened up, but it also opens up a conversation, because I think that when you're talking about it as far as them, they, and intolerance and
Yeah.
those kind of things, and you
Yeah.
really bring it back to an individual perspective and really talk about tolerance and really what does that mean, and really focusing that question to them is like, what does that mean to your family to just be tolerated in your
Totally.
family?
Totally.
What does that mean to your friends to just be tolerated?
Totally.
And that in itself, I haven't seen as aggression, but really as an ability to open up a conversation to see what does that word to tolerate somebody really means when you're talking about a loved one that we're supposed to be, you know, like Dr. Wiley has said, celebrated, and especially when we want to be celebrated and acknowledged for all of the, you know, the greatness that we are. How do we really change that conversation from just this tolerance? Because I think that this tolerance also has to deal with the silence that exists in our communities to say that yes, you know, gay and lesbian as well as trans individuals exist in our communities, but we really just don't talk about that.
Yeah,
But we know
yeah.
they're there, and I think that that is an evolution of the conversation. But I think that we have to continue to push that to where we can really have a very different dialogue that's just not about tolerance, but also about the celebration of, you know, the people who make up our friends and our family.
And Dr. Majid, if you could just elaborate on what we're talking about in terms of Dr. Wiley explained how, you know, his embracing came in stages.
Absolutely.
And I think for a lot of people that, you know, what we've discussed here is the danger of being bullied, being victimized, and becoming the bully or the victimizer when we're talking about this whole process.
Well, one of the things that you started with talking about what was Mr. Obama's leadership, President Obama's leadership around this, and how he's really encouraged us to evolve as a country, and he's actually encouraged the international community to evolve around LGBT issues because he's an African American. So a lot of African countries, I mean, they had a gay pride in Uganda. It's like, that's the most dangerous place in the world to be gay. But, and they said directly, the leaders said, you know, if Mr. Obama could really come out in support of LGBT issues, you know, as the first African American president, then that bolstered, you know, their energy and their enthusiasm and their courage to do that. Because he was not talking about tolerance, he was talking about affirmation and about celebration. However, at the same time, I do recognize what you're saying in terms of helping allies, because allies have to be taught.
Yeah.
And a number of your coming out stories reflected the fact that family members come along in stages, and that when we browbeat people and we say, you know, you need to be celebrating me, you can't just tolerate me, that will not do. They're going to say, all right, that's what I thought. You were always just a little bit too much, you know, as opposed to saying, you know, thank you, you know, I appreciate that you're trying to grow. And who knows, maybe you'll be able to take even further steps so that you reach the point of celebration.
Yeah.
And that's the way that I approach it when I do, because I do a lot of trainings in schools. You know, they'll have a big blow up around black issues, black-white issues, and you know, the white students are being tolerant or intolerant of the black students, and they'll come call me to come in and, you know, do a little fixing conversation. And the way I do it is to really say, everybody here really, the best part of ourselves, the genuine part of ourselves, wants to embrace one another. We've just learned, this is learned behavior that we can unlearn, and these are learned feelings that are associated with what we've been taught. that we can also unlearn. But that
Learned behavior.
that we've got to gently,
Yeah.
undo this stuff and help one another and recognize that it is damaging not just to the LGBT. Homophobia and heterosexism are not just damaging to LGBTQ people. That is a huge, huge misconception. If you have a 7-year-old who loves ballet, and has never had a gay thought in his life, or a 15-year-old who loves ballet and who's in an African-American school and being called gay every day because he loves ballet, this is a potential future dancer, who's can be a major contributor to the arts, to African-American culture that we're squashing because he likes dance. So homophobia has a lot of, negative impacts on people who are not lesbian and gay. And also, we don't want to raise perpetrators because now there's legislation in effect against hate crimes. So if we have our young people going to school using the F word and other epithets against gay and lesbian people, we have to think about that too. We have to make sure we're not becoming or raising perpetrators of homophobia, that we're not doing it in the workplace because we could lose our jobs. So we have to think about it. The president is saying, listen, this is where it's going. So have the conversations with your family like I did, because this is the reality of the world. Your kids are going to be around kids who are gay or kids whose families are gay, and they are going to get kicked out when they say this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose your jobs. Other people are going to lose their jobs. So we've got to move along.
Yeah. May, I want to ask you about your outlook on the future. I mean, the Washington area is different than many other parts of the community. It's just so special in terms of embracing homosexuals and a gay lifestyle. But, we've got a long way to go in other areas. But what do you see? What's your vision?
So I think we have a long way to go, yes, but also I think we have a very positive path there. I think that, like I said before, one of the best ways to move forward is to identify our barriers and to identify and to really acknowledge that language plays an extremely big part in us getting there.
Yeah.
So are we going to talk about stigmas, or are we going to talk about barriers? Are we going to talk about tolerance, or are we going to talk about acceptance? When it comes down to it, really having a rational conversation with those folks that maybe are not there yet, but also realizing that for everyone, it's a learning process. We've all, as people of color, have had that conversation of, this is why you can't say this to me who, I'm brown, or this is why, you can't say that to a black person. And we've all had to, at one point or another, educate an ally about issues of the community, the communities of color. And it's the exact same for the LGBT community. We need to recognize that it's a process. And in my opinion, the process, while it is difficult for a lot of people in a lot of different communities in the US, it's a positive one. Like I said, the millennial generation is supportive of the LGBT community. They are not labeling themselves. They're seeing themselves as a more open generation.
And they recognize their power, for sure, let me tell you.
They recognize their power, and we saw it in 2012, we saw it in 2008.
In the elections, absolutely. Now we want to turn our attention to our studio audience and get any questions or comments that they may have to contribute to this stimulating and provocative and very insightful conversation.
Hi, my name is Angel Z. Jones. I'm a rising sophomore here at Howard University. And I just had a question. Being a young woman of color and also LGBT identified, what would you say to, somebody of color who is coming to a school that's, really around racial issues and being LGBT? What would you say to somebody who's trying to come out, or somebody who is trying to come to terms and things like that?
Benton, you want to offer some insight?
I think the best piece of advice is to really use this time, and I understand the importance of undergrad, to really come into yourself. Because there's going to be so many opportunities or so many instances where individuals are not going to like you. They're not going to like what you have on. They're not going to like what you say. They're not going to like what you do. So get into a practice of just being your unique and authentic self, and then you give them the option of liking what's really there, compared to so often, you know, LGBT individuals have to become this other person, you know, in their mind, because they've created this person to say, well, if I wear my hat like this, or if I wear my clothes like this, you know, they'll like me, or they won't know that I'm LGBT. Until you have to learn much later in life that that's definitely not true. And so the best piece of advice I can be is the advice that everyone gets when they come to college, especially during freshman orientation, is to just, you know, just to be you. And be happy in being, you know, who you are and what you bring to the table, and trust and believe you will attract the people who need to be attracted to you, and you will repel the people who don't need to be around.
Thank you. Well said. Let's go back to the audience. I want to get as many folks in as possible. Hi there, your name and what's your question or comment?
Yes, my name is Leangelo Imperator, and I have a question about relations as it comes to in the homosexual community. I know often we're saying that we're not accepted by the heterosexual community, but more times, especially in the African American homosexual community, we're not even accepted always in our own community as being a homosexual. Sometimes you're viewed as you're gay, and I'm not as gay as you are, you know, so you have that battle that you have to fight within the actual African American homosexual community before you even move to trying to be accepted by heterosexuals. But I was wondering, for those that are in the Latin community or those that are in the Palestinian community, do you face those same challenges within your own community as a homosexual in the Latin community? Are you having struggles there as well before you even move out into the heterosexual community?
Great question.
Definitely. So definitely, and it goes back to sexism. You know, the idea of saying, you know, I'm a top or I'm a bottom or I'm gay or I'm not as gay as you. It goes back to how we treat women in society. It goes back to thinking that men and, you know, male identified individuals and macho folks and, you know, the muscular folks are better than the men that are not as, you know, muscular or not as macho or as not. And it goes back to how we treat women, how the relationships between men and women, the roles that we think men and women should play. So, you know, like you said earlier on, our movements are connected. Your movement is my movement, your progress is mine. If we're really to talk about those issues within the LGBT community, we need to take a step. I keep saying take a step back, but essentially we do. We need to analyze how all the different movements are interacting with each other. And I honestly do believe that those comments are coming from a place of gender and sexual hierarchy. And in order for, I very much believe that as soon as men and women are equal, the idea of I'm less gay than you are is not going to be an issue anymore.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. Yes, your name and your question or comment.
Hi, once again, I am Dia Bennett, a rising junior here at Howard University and Howard University's Cascade, the LGBT organization president. What do you think is the most difficult thing about being Black, gay, and male?
I think it's the fear of what happens when you're not doing it right, as far as like in your life, like what happens and what do people think? Because I think that throughout my process, whether we talk about me coming out being gay, whether we talk about me coming out being HIV positive, whether we talk about a number of different things, it was always the time that I had with myself to kind of think about, okay, if I do this or if I present myself in this kind of way, what will people think about me? What are people going to do? And so that also becomes some of the most paralyzing of your behaviors, because your thoughts are really what dictates your actions. So before you even think about what your parents are going to do or what I'm in a fraternity as well, what my frat brothers are going to say or what, all these different things, those are the conversations that play in your head over and over again. And if you become victim to it, it prevents you from being able to live your life, which to me brings a larger fear. What happens if I wake up and I'm 40 or 50 years old and I didn't get to do this because of that? And that's something that's not a life that I wanted to live, for the simple fact that I wasn't raised like that. And I wanted to be able to really overcome that fear, to just be venting. And I think that that's sometimes as we have the millennial conversation, why a lot of young people, and I'm only 29, don't want to have the label, because at the end of the day, people just want to be themselves. They don't want to be I mean, growing up, I had no idea that I was going to be, the LGBT advocate. I didn't know that I was going to be the HIV/AIDS advocate. I just wanted to be venting and be okay in that place. So I think that that's the biggest thing, that fear as a black gay man of not doing it right and not making your family proud, as the quote unquote man of the house.
Very good point. Very good point. I want to wrap things up. This has been a very informative, insightful discussion. We've learned so much, and there is still so much more to talk about. I want to move now into some final thoughts and comments, because I think that was a great way to end the conversation with the audience. But I want to give some final thoughts, get some final thoughts from you all before we end this discussion here right now. Reverend Dr. Wiley, you first. Final thoughts.
Well, I'll just say, picking up on the question about allies and some of the comments that we made, I think that allies have to have a certain humility and understanding, as you have said, that we are learning. I always tell my wife that I'm a recovering sexist, okay? In other words, I understand that I've got, the society has taught me how to have male privilege, so I need to be humble about that. And I remember when growing up in the segregated South, we would have white liberals who claimed to be on our side, but then you could always tell if they came into a meeting and tried to tell you what to do, then you knew that something was wrong. So I think that there is a certain humility that we need to have as allies as we learn and as we grow.
Thank you for that. May?
I think it's really important to highlight the importance of language, the importance of thinking about what we say, make sure that we mean what we say, and make sure we're coming from a place of love and understanding. We all, it's not like we either have privilege or we don't. We all are privileged in some way. Some of you that are in college are privileged because you are in college. Some of you that, have a job are privileged because you have a job. So thinking about our movements as being connected, thinking about the different identities we have and those identities that we don't have, and how we can work together to be conscious citizens of the world, being conscious global citizens, and how if we are to create a more inclusive space for everyone, we need to be strong allies and conscious allies.
All right, let me swing things on over to Dr. Majid. Final thoughts. What should we think about as we digest this conversation and move on with our lives in the world where we live with LGBT people?
I think the first thing we can really start with is wellness and looking internally at how we're doing. Because often when we're oppressive towards other people, it reflects some way that we're not feeling that great about ourselves. We don't have kind of an internal groundedness, right? We need to oppress other people because we don't feel powerful, so we try to take away other people's power. So I think that that's the place to begin, for people of every constituency, LGBT, people of color, people of the global majority, all of us need to begin there and to continue to grow in wellness because, as Benton was talking about earlier, sexuality is a conversation that's not had enough at all. One of the articles that's on the table is one that I wrote about having the conversation about healthy sexuality in the Black community, period. Because Black youth are sexually active at earlier ages than any other youth. And I am not talking about gay youth. I'm talking about heterosexual Black youth. So wellness in the global majority, people of color communities is, I think, the place to begin. And looking internally at how well are we emotionally and socially and psychologically. And then we can try to grow wellness in our communities because that's real liberation. The internal liberation that comes from freeing ourselves from the need to freeing ourselves from the internal disempowerment that makes us want to have power over other people.
Thank you so much. Vinton.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the space that we're in now. To be on a predominantly Black historic university's campus having this conversation, to me, is huge. And we have to continue to have those conversations. And especially, I think it's important for community to be able to see these conversations, but also see people that look like them having this conversation, and being able to encourage those individuals to have those conversations with their loved ones. It's not always waiting for somebody to come to you to have this conversation. Sometimes you have to go have that conversation, you know, especially as you talk about the historic perspective of the LGBT as well as the civil rights movement that sometimes didn't come so gently.
Yeah.
Sometimes it came from movement, it came from activism, it came from raising your voices. And I think that we have to get our community to a place, however we get that position to that place, of having LGBT individuals able to come out and have these conversations, but also we have to, as leaders, being able to create safe spaces for individuals to be able to have that conversation and feel safe in having that conversation. You know, the different legislation that exists around is still real. I mean, the penalties for coming out, you know, are still real. We're here in 2000, you know, not even a year ago, an individual could be, you know, removed from the military. We still have, you know, policies in place where people can still lose their jobs as LGBT individuals. So, you know, making sure that we still create those safe spaces for individuals to be able to come out and have the conversation, but we have to also acknowledge that we are here having that conversation.
Absolutely.
And we just have to continue to fight that fight.
Thank you. Tariq.
You know, and something you told me before, Millette, of even my work with Palestine, Israel, of if you want to reach the African American audiences, go to the churches and say your piece there about Palestine, Israel, and our fight as an oppressed nation. And I'm honored to be here sitting around with mostly African Americans talking about and relating it on a topic, on a completely different topic than what I would have thought. So my friend Luma asked me to be on this show. I definitely felt honored, but I definitely feel so much more just love and ease in being here. And I guess my only reflection is that it's a lesson for me to continue reaching out, as you had advised, but not just on Palestinian rights, but as a Palestinian queer person. Because for many years, I had also fallen into compartmentalizing my Palestine nonviolence work and separated from gay issues. And that could come out of my own fear and what people interpret, how they would reflect on me. So I appreciate my learning today, if anything.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you all for being here and helping us to really understand and learn more from each and every one of you. Well, there you have it. We hope that you too have enjoyed this stimulating conversation and have heard something that inspires you to keep this dialogue going. To learn more about this program or the others in our series, please go to our website, www.whut.org. I am Molette Green. We'll see you next time on Vocal Point, right here on WHUT TV.